Mike Carl. It's true he did his undergrad at WVU. This photo shows us proof, and a young Mike Carl, too. Then off to an Ivy League school for a law degree in a leather-bound cover, which he accepted, then replied, "Thank you, sir. May I have another?" But when I look at this photo, I see a young man with lots of charms. But I also see Greg Marmalade, Omega Theta Pi Sergeant of Arms. Mike, that is a handsome, strapping young man right there.
Well, after 70-some years, you kind of deteriorate. But
You kind of deteriorate?
He means the picture's blurry.
right.
That's a wonderful. Now, there's something unique about that basketball team where you were the team manager, correct?
Yeah, it was the first racially integrated basketball team at WVU.
That's awesome. Congratulations on being a part of that.
Well, it was a wonderful, just another one of the very lucky turns in my life.
Very nice. And you do kind of look like Greg Marmalade there from Animal House in that picture there. We move on to our next one here, and that is, you know this guy as a New York Times bestselling author and show co-host. But there's more to him than meets the eye, not that he's one to boast. So this week I find out that our man John Gilstrap is not just an author and co-host, but a YouTube archive chap. Do this on your own. Not making this up. Search Christmas variety shows, Perry Como's Early American Christmas, and this is insane. And you'll find John Gilstrap in a chair in front of the fireplace, drinking a beer and singing Christmas carols with Perry Como and John Wayne.
That's true. Perry Como Christmas special. There was real beer in there, and there were like 15 takes. Everybody in that room was hammered by the time it was done. And it wasn't yet 7 in the morning.
And you got to be a part of that show because of why?
I was part of the William and Mary Choir, and we did, back then, the choir did, we met presidents and emperors and queens, and Perry Como shot his Christmas special there.
That's awesome.
And John Wayne. It was John Wayne's last, we didn't know it at the time, of course, but it was his last film performance.
And when you asked John Wayne for his autograph, he said?
No. It was a one-word answer. He just said no.
Had a few too many beers to be able to write, maybe?
Larry, you're up next. Some people look at the Republican Party's direction and worry. Larry Schultz looks at it going further right and says, hurry. Larry says, shut down the government, enact a total abortion ban. Are you the Republican Party or are you the Taliban? While the party's right wants to run the House with the subtlety of a barge, Larry says, just keep doing what you're doing, Republicans, and soon we'll be back in charge.
It's great to be here.
That wasn't meant to be funny, by the way.
Sad but true.
All right, Joe, you're up next, and you'll be happy to know your old photo is no longer part of the equation.
There you go. Happy.
I'm happy about that, too.
Little Joe Dolce in the background here. Did you know there's never been an Italian president? Not one name ending in a vowel as a White House resident. There's one Republican candidate who is Sicilian, or at least half. That's former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, who Wednesday night made me laugh. He got me, Joe Ferretti, with this blow on Trump, which he struck. He said, since he's not at the debate, instead of Donald Trump, we should call him Donald Duck. He did say that.
It's the same laugh he got at the thing.
I enjoyed it, however. All right, this is serious stuff now here, ladies and gentlemen. There's a well-known tradition up by the river, you see, carried out by potential candidates who come to bend the knee. It seems that the Admiral cannot refuse a favor on the day when he hosts pizza night. Sometimes those favors are heavy, sometimes they are light. They arrive at the compound with all the hope that they can bring. But mostly, they come in respect and for pizza, and of course to kiss the ring. Someday, says the Admiral to them, and that day may never come, I may call on you to do a service, no matter where you're from. But until that day, accept this favor as a gift, please. And oh yeah, did you want pepperoni with that slice of cheese?
You've been watching too many mafia movies, Rob.
Nonsense. There's no such thing as watching too many mafia movies. All right, we begin with our leadoff hitter, Joey Torts Ferretti via telephone. Joe.
Well, I guess on the heels of listening to Chris Miller in the last segment, I'm going to go to education again because that seems to be a vexing problem, both in the state of West Virginia and nationally. 4 or 5 shows ago, I brought up the fact that we have fallen behind on teacher pay now, where we're 50th in the country in teacher pay. So that's clearly something that needs to be thought about as we come around this next election cycle. But I've got another problem that I see as being perhaps symptomatic, but also I think endemic in terms of how do we try to improve our schools. And that is the chronic absenteeism that's taking place both nationally and in West Virginia. Before the pandemic, roughly 8 million students nationwide were considered chronically absent, which is defined as 18 or more days missed during the school year. Now, after the pandemic, it is doubled to 16 million students who are chronically absent. That works out, folks, to 1 out of 3 students who attend primary and secondary schools in this country are not showing up. There is no amount of money that you can pay teachers. There's no amount of cutting you can do at the state Board of Education level. There is no amount of curriculum wrangling and wrestling that we do in school board meetings that is going to affect school performance if the kids aren't there. So what do we do about the fact that we have a failure of parents and guardians and whoever's in charge of these students to get them to school? What policies, beyond enforcing the truancy laws, which are on the books, but I fear are not all that readily enforced, what do we do to make sure that the kids are in class and able to learn rather than sitting at home because they learned during COVID that maybe attending school isn't all that important? And in West Virginia, by the way, we are not immune to this problem. Pre-COVID, 20% of our students were chronically absent. It is now 30% of our students in the state of West Virginia considered chronically absent. So the question I have is, what do we do? I think we have to be coming down hard on parents and guardians who aren't getting these kids to school. But I think there's other solutions, too. We have to devise ways of developing a real bond between parents and the school system so that it becomes considered a part of everyday life that the parents have to give attention to get these kids to school, so that education is emphasized both in school and at home. It's a cultural issue, too, in West Virginia and nationwide. We've got to strike at the heart of that problem also. So I'm interested in other thoughts on this, but I think we could do and think about whatever we want to do as far as spending money for schools. If the kids aren't there, it's not going to matter.
All right. Is the current system of promoting them regardless of whether they've passed or not off the table, Joe?
Oh, no. And I have read some articles about the Scandinavian countries who have the highest rated schools in the world and how they deal with that. And it's completely different than how we deal with it. They don't pass kids along. But their whole elementary school system is structured differently than ours. And we have to start thinking outside the box if we're going to tackle this problem.
Let's go around the table, starting first to my left, John Gilstrap.
I think, yes, obviously it's a problem, and a largely created problem. I think that the vast government overreach during the COVID response, where we decided, with the cooperation of the teachers' unions, to keep schools closed, which we knew actively, we had to know was going to create a lot of issues with kids, and now we're seeing it. We're seeing mental health spikes, we're seeing addiction spikes, we're seeing truant spikes, and we have to understand that, first of all, I don't lay this necessarily at the feet of the parents, although we certainly need to have better parenting that's going on. We created this problem, and now we have to put the genie back in the bottle. And unfortunately, I think that any kids, when you consider how old they are when they're in school, now they've lost 3 years or 2.5 years of socialization, of interaction with their peers, and it's been replaced by the toxicity of online communications. How do we establish the bond between teachers and their schools? We have to make the schools be an attractive place to be. Nationwide, I don't know if this is a problem in West Virginia. I didn't. My son did not go to school in West Virginia. We weren't living here at the time, but schools are now telling parents what they're supposed to be doing with their children instead of listening to the desires of parents. I think if we make the schools a place of learning as opposed to social orientation and social change, if we make schools not the first responder in family crises, then maybe we end up creating that bond between parent and child. But it certainly is a problem. I think we also have to understand that in parts of the state, not everybody is in Eastern Panhandle. There are parts of the state. This came as a surprise to me when I was talking to folks. They can't get to school. You know, they don't have school buses, or if they have school buses, they're unreliable, and mom and dad are working all the time. So, you know, there are issues certainly in the southern part of the state and coal country where just getting to school is part of the problem. I don't think there's a quick solution to it, but you're right, Joe. It's something that definitely needs to be addressed and needs to be addressed sooner than later.
Mr. Carl.
Well, I agree with John about what exacerbated that. There'd been a problem for some time, but it got a lot worse under the COVID mess. But I think that first and foremost is that you don't pass on to the next grade unless you complete the academic work in an adequate way. But on top of that, the parents need an incentive, and some I think the introduction suggested there should be some kind of a civil penalty for failing to get your kid to the school, and maybe it ought to be tied to the some fraction of the lost the wasted public funds and something like that. But I think that both the getting rid of the automatic pass on to the next grade and a well considered civil penalty for the parents for not getting them to school.
Admiral.
Yeah, we tend to put everything at the feet of COVID, and no question that COVID affected and influenced our life in a host of ways. Most of it not to the better. However, we had this problem before COVID. We're having this problem now. If you look at it on both an absolute sense and in relative sense, we're not doing well. But it's a very complex problem. My sense is, and I know a lot of folks have looked at it, the legislators have looked at it, the teachers union looked at it, various other groups have looked at it, but so far we have not found a solution to it. My sense is that we're just picking at the edges and not going to the kernel of the problem. We're trying to fix one facet of it and not really concerned about the effect of where if you push in one place, somewhere else is going to bulge out. My sense is that someone puts together with representatives of all the demographics, and not for one weekend, not for 2 weekends, but for long enough that we can actually think outside of the box, look where we're going wrong, and look how we can improve it. It has to be an integrated approach. It has to include all the demographics that's involved, but it has to be thorough enough that we get away from this routine that we've had for the last several years. We've come up with a problem. We've come up with a couple of solutions. Then we forget about it. This is much, much too complex for that to happen. We've got to get a group to look at it hard, and come up with how we can possibly solve the difficult problem.
Larry Schultz.
Yeah, I'm not an education expert by any means. I do believe this was a serious problem before COVID that may have been exacerbated somewhat by the school shutdowns. But, for example, one of the things we haven't spoken about is if you take a first grader who is expected to be able to read at some basic level when they complete, read individual words, know all their letters, etc., and you put that child in second grade, even though that child hasn't gone through all the other stuff, what will begin to happen in our school system is that the teachers will begin to seek a recommendation for an individualized educational program as though the child were a special needs child. So as you don't teach the very basics, you start to have the same assumption that the kid was there and couldn't learn it, so we need a specialized program. I presume that along with this 30% number of kids who aren't attending the minimum number of classes, we're also seeing a spike in special education referrals. And it's not special ed, for crying out loud. They're behind because they haven't been to school. One of the things I would say is this is not just a problem of the parents. It is something the parents can be blamed for in a lot of cases, but this is a problem for every single one of us. Because if you live in a community, someday when you call the ambulance, one of those kids is going to be driving it. And another one of those kids is going to be the person who's pushing on your chest to keep you alive until you get to the hospital. You better hope they learn their business. We have a tendency to forget about the fact that this is our future workforce. And you're not going to have a very good workforce if they don't have the basics, arithmetic, and you know, we don't all use algebra every single day in our jobs. The basic comments of geometry are kind of important. But reading, for crying out loud, reading is an absolute must for most gainful employment that doesn't require a degree. And if we as a community don't do something about it, and by that what I mean is if you've got a neighbor who's got school-age kids and they're playing in the yard all day, go ask if you can help get them to school. Maybe mom can't get them to school. Maybe there's a daycare person coming in who doesn't have a car, whatever. If you're retired and you live next door, go offer to drive them to school. All they can tell you is no, as long as you do it carefully and not suggest that they're terrible parents. But at least you've stepped outside your role as the neighbor who ignores what's going on next door and reached out on behalf of the community to do something. You might be surprised at how often people say, oh, thank God. Yes, get these kids to school. I can't get them to go. I talk to people who literally there are kids 2 blocks from the school. We're not talking about a bus. We're talking about a 2-block walk who can't or won't do it. If you have to send people out from the school, I would rather have the kids come to a dirty school holding hands with a janitor than not come to a clean school at all. So we need to get a little creative with the way we solve this.
All right, Mike Carl, you wanted to say something.
One good note is that in this past session, the West Virginia legislature did enact a law. I don't remember all the details, but required at an early level of the grade school certain testing sufficiency to move up. And so that was a move in the right direction. But I also agree the far broader resolution is important.
Joe, comes back to you.
Well, a couple thoughts. I think Larry's right. It's hard to hold all these parents accountable and place the blame at home all the time. When a parent's working 2 jobs and struggling to make ends meet and has trouble getting their kid to school, doesn't have the time, doesn't have the energy in many respects. What the Scandinavian countries have figured out, and we know this intuitively because we've addressed this somewhat in our country, the preschool learning that is so critical to developing the good habits that young children need as they proceed up through their grades. The Scandinavian countries have figured out that they have elementary school where you will have the same teacher, not just for 180 days, but for 3 years. That teacher will be teaching that child in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade. The teacher comes to know intimately the parental situation at home, the family life, the financial struggles that family may have. And the teacher knows all of those kids and their family situations and can reach out to neighbors and friends and say, hey, this family needs help getting this kid to school. They don't have transportation. They don't have the right clothing that the kid feels embarrassed to wear at school. Can you help? And so a real relationship develops at a very young age between the school and the home life. And that has worked wonders in those countries to getting these kids on the right path, to getting them to understand the importance of learning and how that's going to shape their lives in the future. So we need, I think, politicians and others to start thinking outside the box, okay? Not passing kids on because they're not meeting grade level requirements is one step, but it's a small step. We really need to start taking large steps. I've often said a Marshall Plan to just develop education to meet today's needs. I'm not hearing that from politicians. I watch the Republican debate, and it's they go after teachers unions, and I listen to people at the state level, and they're talking about doing away with the State Department of Education. Okay, fine, but give me the alternatives. What are you going to do to address some of these problems that are endemic? And I'm yet to hear that, and I've yet to hear any real commitment to that. And I think we better start demanding it because, as statistics show, with a country that's ranked 125th worldwide in literacy, we got a problem, and we better start working on it seriously.
Rotting from within, right? Hey, got this from Berkeley County Prosecuting Attorney Kitty Wilkes-Delegetti, who said that parents do get charged with truancy, which is a misdemeanor. They generally get an opportunity to improve attendance, and a fine can be assessed, and if they are repeat offenders, there's also the potential for jail time. So that from Katie Wilkes-Delegetti, who said she'd be happy to talk more about that. We'll try to get that set up. We have our Friday crew on hand here, including Joey Torts ready via telephone. Joseph, welcome back.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
Glad to have you back. Also in studio, John Gilstrap, New York Times bestselling author. Mr. Gilstrap.
Good morning.
Mr. Michael Carl, senior member of the crew.
Good morning.
Lawrence Schultz, attorney at law.
Great to be here.
And the man who is on the clock with issue number 2 with the Admiral, Bill Stubblefield.
Rob, before I go to my issue, I want to give a shout out to you and Colin. Most of us, if we have a spotlight on us, something doesn't go right, we panic. 75% of your toys this morning, tools, whatever you want to call them, are on the blink. And yet you and Colin are able to keep this thing going, and I would be pulling my hair out, probably cursing. And if I had to curse somebody, it'd probably be John Gilstrap for pulling the button that I wasn't aware of.
I would curse at him, too. I've reminded people of this many times, Bill. I'm a professional. Don't try this at home.
Okay. Yeah. My issue, Rob, is following the 2020 census, there were a lot of regrowing the voting boundaries, the gerrymandering. And several were drawn to, in the eyes of the beholder, to the detriment of one group as opposed to another group. Well, they're the ones that have those that felt that were egregious in how they were regrown are now working their way to the Supreme Court. This past week, Alabama's regrown district has been rejected by the Supreme Court for the second time. And the root of what they rejected is that it did not give the minority voters a large enough share to elect their candidate of choice. What was done with the gerrymandering was take a predominantly minority district and carve it into 3 or 4 so that the minorities are always at a minority when it came to voting. What the Voting Rights Act says, there has to be consolidated, condensed enough so that everyone, all racial minorities, have an equal opportunity to participate in the electoral process. And what this may mean, what it probably will mean, is that there will be another minority district in Alabama. So I think there will probably they will still keep the same number, but it's going to be withdrawn, so a second minority district. The interesting part of this, or not the interesting, but the other part is that Alabama's not alone in this. Other states as well, Louisiana, Georgia, New York State. So there's several that are being looked at hard by the Supreme Court. My question to my panelists, how big a deal is the Supreme Court rejecting Alabama's recently regrown voting district map to us as individuals? And we already realize that the House of Representatives is very finely divided right now, not very much of a margin. This could well shift the power base from one party to another party.
We start on the phone with you, Joey Torts Ferretti.
Well, it's a big deal, Bill, and allow me just to editorialize for 60 seconds. The Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act included a provision in there where certain states that met a criteria in the formula for which I couldn't even begin to explain, but there were certain states before they were able to redraw their maps for redistricting had to get pre-clearance by a United States District Court sitting in D.C., overseen by the Attorney General. That system was in place since the mid-'60s. That law had a sunset provision. Every 5 years, Congress had to reauthorize that law before it could remain on the books. And each year, Congress would reauthorize that law by increasingly larger vote totals in Congress. In other words, a consensus developed that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was critical for the free, fair elections in this country in certain jurisdictions where in the past they have shown an inability to be fair. The Supreme Court in the Shelby decision about 5-6 years ago invalidated Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act against the will of Congress. The conservative justices on the Supreme Court legislated from the bench, in other words. And now we don't have that system. So what happened afterwards is what you're seeing in Alabama and what you're seeing in North Carolina and what you're seeing in Louisiana and elsewhere. States, by the way, who were subject to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. There's a lot of game playing going on, drawing maps and trying to marginalize certain voters. Thankfully, the Supreme Court, however, in a very close vote, invalidated what Alabama was doing, so they're back to the drawing board. But that won't always be the case. So I lay the feet at the Supreme Court itself for legislating from the bench and doing away with Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. We'll continue to have this battle in certain states, and I suspect in some cases their redrawn maps will pass muster with the Supreme Court, and we'll go on with a concern that has always been the case: certain voting blocks, certain voting constituencies not having equal representation at the voting booth.
Joe, thank you. And before we continue, I've just got a text, and I've confirmed it through NBC News, the New York Times, Politico, that Senator Dianne Feinstein has passed away at the age of 90. And that was CNBC reporting 24 minutes ago is the first report I see on that. And then the Times about 6-7 minutes ago also with that piece of information. Senator Dianne Feinstein has passed away at the age of 90. Now, to continue along on this part of the conversation, let's go to Mike Carl next. Michael.
Well, one of the things to keep in mind in this discussion is how ambiguity and evolving circumstances. I mean, I agree it's a problem, and I didn't know or wasn't aware of the override to the Supreme Court that Joe just described, but maybe this vote on Alabama was a step back and recognition of the problem that they had created, or because under that old system there was still a judicial involvement and independence, and but the fact that people move and population shift means it's an ongoing issue, but it has to be addressed in a way, and it can't, at the very least, it can't be apparent that you're redrawing lines for a political advantage, and so I there's a lot of ambiguity here, but a concern and a system to minimize the arbitrariness and political game playing needs to be there.
Larry.
What the effect of what the Supreme Court did is it takes the initial review out. The initial review before a U.S. district judge in Washington is gone. And so now this thing bubbles through litigation for 4 or 5 years. And during that time, they're still electing a congressman every 2 years. So what they've done is say, oh, yes, this is unfair. but we're going to delay it for a while and let the unfairness carry on until it's obvious to us. And that just doesn't make sense from the standpoint of, if you see a problem, you get on that problem as soon as you can. They sort of just delayed it, and that's a shame. That district in Alabama was rewritten after the 2020 census. It's now 2023. How long until they get new district lines and re-enfranchise the people who were sliced out? To take what Joe was saying and maybe make it more graphic, take your cell phone or any rectangular piece and imagine that is a minority-rich part of a particular state. Then draw a plus sign over the top of it, cut it into 4 pieces, and each one of those becomes a part of a majority-white district. You're never going to get a congressman, or almost never, going to get a congressman or woman who has those racial characteristics, because they just split their group into 4s. And that's what they do. And everybody knows they do it. They've been doing it. They darn sure did it all the time, right during Reconstruction. But now they're doing it a lot more.
And let's don't forget which party led that effort.
Well, and which party is leading it now?
I agree.
That led the Supreme Court to tear down the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
That we know which party that was. I'm surprised, and this must be pretty egregious, if the 6 Republicans, or a majority of them, on the United States Supreme Court all voted to say, no, you can't do this. This goes too far.
They did it twice.
Yeah.
All right, John Gilstrap.
Over the course of the last certainly 5 years, maybe 10 years, the phrase systemic racism has been thrown around a lot, and I think it's been applied to a lot of places and a lot of activities where I frankly, as a white guy, I think it's an overreach. But the underpinnings of this on both sides are that minority voters are going to vote a certain way. That if they have certain physical attributes, then they are going to vote either Democrat or Republican. And there's a cynicism that's involved on both sides of this. That the Alabama legislature, the ones who redrew the district, one could assume were making the racial call. And then on the other side of it, in disallowing the gerrymandering, the Supreme Court is accepting the premise that minorities vote a certain way. The key here is to keep, for everybody, to just stop looking at the race. And it starts with the legislature, the state. They should never have done that. And the cynicism that's involved by splitting people by color or by racial orientation, whatever is the right term, that is inherently cynical and a terrible thing to do. So I think a justice has been done in rejecting the gerrymandering. I think an injustice was done in the gerrymandering itself, but this is not this isn't an indictment on the process of gerrymandering voting districts after censuses are taken. We divide. Every legislature divides by party, right? You want to, if you're going to move voting lines, you want to make sure if you're a Democratic legislature, you want to make sure that you have more Democrat districts than Republican districts. So that will continue, I think, into the future, and that's not discriminatory. What's discriminatory is when it gets tied to the any orientation, any external non-political orientation that goes to how people look or what they do in bedrooms and such. I think it's a good decision.
It is not the decision, but the two distinctions you just drew are unfortunate, because if you look at next door at Maryland, where I'm a resident, if you look at the map of Maryland by counties in terms of how it votes in presidential elections, you code it blue or you code it red. It's not uncommon for 19 or 20 to be coded red and 3 to be coded blue. But the population centers of Maryland are Baltimore, PG, and Montgomery County, which are blue. There's 9 congressional representatives from Maryland. 8 are Democrats. It used to be 7, and then they redrew the western districts to pop a whole bunch of Montgomery County in there to get Roscoe Bartlett out so they can get an 8th Democrat in Maryland. Now, when you look at 20 of 23 counties voting Republican, but they aren't the population centers of the state, it would seem that it should be a better representation than 8 out of 9 on the Democrats versus Republicans. But that's the way they drew it. But that kind of gerrymandering is permissible. That doesn't make any sense to me. Bill, you get to close it up.
Yeah, it makes sense in that Maryland was not racially driven. It was politically driven.
No, I'm aware of that.
Yeah,
That's the point I'm saying is it's being politically driven doesn't seem to me to be appealing either.
Because it does not violate the Congressional Voting Act. What we're seeing in Alabama and probably Georgia and probably Louisiana and probably New York is all going to be by race.
I'm aware of that.
It's the commandment is one man, one vote, one person, one vote, not 1 square mile, one vote, or 1 county, one vote. So that's the basis of the distinction being made, that it's the people and the numbers of people, because we still have a system where 1 vote counts the same as all the others, and you count them up at the end. And assuming no one claims election fraud, you get that over pretty cleanly immediately.
Issue number 3 goes to Mr. Gilstrap there. Go ahead, John.
In the early 80s, I manufactured some of the first Stinger anti-aircraft rockets, and we distributed them to the Mujahideen so that they could shoot down Russian airplanes. And we learned a lot about the Russian military and about our capabilities versus the Russian military through this proxy war through Afghanistan. Mujahideen became Taliban, and it wasn't the best idea in the world. In the first Gulf War, we learned a lot about our tank capability against the Russians through the proxy war of shooting for Kuwait and in Iraq. So here we are in Ukraine. 500,000 casualties so far, 300 from the Russian side, 200 from the Ukrainian side. We're in for about $80 billion of American money into this, and we just approved now, 2 years into the war, we've said, okay, we can release F-16s, and we're going to give them a bunch of Abrams tanks to fight. My question is, and $80 billion is a lot. That's the equivalent of the budget of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I mean, it's a lot of money. So, are we in fact, given the fact that Putin isn't going to surrender and Zelensky can't surrender, I mean, he'll see the end of a rope. Are we in fact fighting a proxy war? Are we trying to hurt the Russians with Ukrainian blood? Or are we really trying to help the Ukrainians win against an oppressive Russia? And given that nobody wants to surrender, how does it end?
Admiral?
Yeah, this question is not new. I'm reading a book now that in 1939, 97% of the folks in the U.S. did not want to become engaged in the war in Europe. We took all sorts of steps to prevent this. Now, rightly or wrongly, the decision we did in the late 1930s, early 1940s is coming back to influence our position with Ukraine. I've had the opportunity to travel Ukraine. It's the people as marvelous as anybody I've ever met. I do not put it in the view that we're trying to penalize Putin. I put it in the view that we have a need, a human rights need that we can influence the outcome. I, for one, have no objection whatsoever in funding Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's become a political issue, as most things we have in the States. It is political. I would like to back off from the political ramifications and just look at it from the human compassion aspect.
Mr. Schultz.
Yeah, the war will continue whether we are there or not. Now, it won't continue as long if we pull out and stop supporting Ukraine. And the numbers of casualties will flip from 300 Russian, 200 Ukraine to 700 or 800 Ukraine or 1 million Ukraine and some lesser number for the Russians. But this war is going to go on until Putin either gets beat back and can't take it anymore and gets replaced by the Russian people, or wins. And so if we pull out, we are handing over Ukraine to Russia, because in the end, they will overrun them if they have to with every available soul. Now, would Russia be greatly weakened by that effort? Could be, but not as weakened as they will be if there's U.S. tanks and U.S. aircraft in there fighting them back every day. It's just a question of how quickly do we want to see this resolved. And it would be nice if it were over soon. It would be over very soon if we got out, I believe. And then you wouldn't get a reliable count of the casualties, because they'd be killing them by the thousands, tens of thousands. And the Ukrainians would be just destroyed. I can't, as a person who pays some of those $80 billion in taxes, I'm okay with that. I'm not loving it, but it's better than the alternative for me.
Mr. Carl.
Well, the world changed in the 40s and 50s, and since then, neo-isolationism would be a disaster for the United States. If we backed away in Ukraine, it would encourage the worst people in the world, and we cannot afford that, and the role we play in the world doesn't permit us to do that.
Mr. Ferretti.
Amen. If you're the leading superpower in the world, you can't cut and run on a democracy. As imperfect a democracy as Ukraine is, and I think we can all agree on that, you can't not support it at this point. It is a terrible message to the world and to fledgling democracies in the world who either are or someday will be our partners. I see this, and I think the U.S. Senate sees this, where there's about a 75 to 80 vote majority for continuing to support Ukraine. I think they see it as a proxy war between the United States and China, because China, in many ways, is financially supporting Russia to the point where they can continue the war. They're buying Russian wheat and oil and whatever other few commodities Russia can put on the market. China's buying it. And now China convinced North Korea to help with armaments. This is a proxy war, I believe, between the CCP and the United States. And the concern is Southeast Asia and what China might eventually do down there. So it's all about message sending. It's unfortunate that many lives and souls are going to be lost in this proxy war, but I think that's the larger picture, and I think that's the way the U.S. Senate sees it. And I think as long as they are supportive in the numbers they are now, the money's going to continue to flow.
Comes back to you, John Gilstrap.
I don't disagree with anything that's been said here. This is actually an honest question on my part. It's something I've been struggling with. Bill, I'm glad you brought up the late 30s and into the early 40s. When the United States was shipping Liberty ships and such to England and kind of helping them out, it was sort of a stalemate in Europe. And then when the United States finally decided, okay, we entered with the idea of crushing the enemy, and we crushed the enemy. Since then, we've had these long, drawn-out bloodbaths without resolution, whether pick a fight since World War II. And it seems to me we didn't care that much about Georgia. We didn't care that much about Crimea. Now we care a lot about Ukraine. Okay. And the first thing we offered Ukraine at the very beginning was essentially nothing, but we offered to give Zelensky asylum. And he very famously said, I don't want to ride, I want ammunition, which is one of the great political lines ever. So I don't know where I sit on this. I think that it's just going to, Ukraine's going to bleed to death unless somebody takes definitive action. And if we're going to get into this, let's get into it. But just watching a beautiful country get destroyed and beautiful people get killed, it seems it's just sad, and I don't know what to do about it.
John, if I could. There's a misconception that we're funding the war against Ukraine. We're putting a lot of money into the war, but the amount of money we're putting in pales compared to what the European Union puts in. And then in addition to the European Union, the various countries putting in quite a bit as well.
Well, the European Union is a bunch of countries.
I know, but my point is that the United States is putting in less money than the European Union.
Mr. Schultz, you're on the clock. I'll just keep the music going until your clock is ready. Obviously, Larry's operating on Eastern
on the clock.
savings time. Yeah.
Given that the U.S. Border Patrol will be furloughed if the government shuts down, can we add border security to the long list of items congressional Republicans claim to care about but don't?
You never miss a chance to take a shot. All right, who would like to defend the congressional Republicans, Mr. Carl?
I'll be happy to. First of all they need to do is not furlough them and promise them to be paid, and it's just a delay. It's just a matter of time and weeks at most that before this is fixed. So you're making a argument against this, the failure to agree on extension. It's just absurd. It doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to work the way you're saying.
I just suggest that there's probably people who get a Border Patrol paycheck who don't have 3 or 4 weeks of luxury within that.
There's limits to it for sure. I agree, but we're, the government absolutely ought to commit to make up any lost pay.
Oh, they do,
and they do. It's in the law.
Oh, that's in the law.
Yeah,
that's not going to change anything.
Well, that's not but you don't have a furlough. In other words, if somebody just stops working because they're not getting their regular timely payment, that's a whole different story.
Aren't there laws that forbid the compelling of a person to work without pay? Don't we have laws about that, attorneys?
The wage
in the room?
payment and collection.
It's not
Act.
without pay. It's just the timing of the pay that's an issue.
But
that's also covered by the wage
not
payment and collection
a
Act.
deal.
In fact, there could be bonuses added, and I would support,
But there aren't.
for delay in payments.
Yeah, there aren't, though. So if it's not a big deal, then why doesn't Congress forego their own pay while they shut everybody down?
Oh, now there's a good point.
No, it's in the Constitution. It's in the Constitution.
It's in the Constitution that Congress must be paid when they shut the government down.
I don't know if it's absent or government shut down or not, but that's the argument's been made that it's in the Constitution. They have no real say-so.
Well, there's constitutional amendments. We have a few of those.
Right.
Yeah.
If we believe so strongly in the cause, then we should believe. I guarantee, if you put a constitutional amendment up for vote, they don't have the support of the people. That if we say we're shutting down the government, you don't get paid, but we do. I bet the people would approve a constitutional amendment to change that
overwhelmingly.
I agree with you, Rob and Mike, but that was not your question. Your question was, why are they being paid? And the reason is it's in the Constitution.
All right, then let's change it.
Let's change it. While we're doing that, let's change a lot of other things.
That some court said it's in the Constitution. It's not expressly in the Constitution.
I don't remember reading it there.
I want to address Larry's false dichotomy right on the nose about, the Border Patrol is indication of all the things that the Republicans don't care about. It is a false dichotomy, and I think you put it out there, knowing that it was. The larger argument is about the shutdown, and the Republicans are going to take this on the nose. They always do. But I think if you were to get Matt Gaetz in here, he would tell you, whether you like him or not, he would tell you that he's doing this for the betterment of the country because there are elements within the spending package that will be harmful to the country. I would argue, get more Republicans elected and pass budgets that don't have that stuff in
we
them.
did that.
Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but when Trump won his first term, did the Republicans not control the House and the Senate the first 2 years?
They did, but
how many balanced budgets did the Republicans put out during those 2 years?
0.
None.
How many attempts at seriously cutting spending did the Republicans make during those 2 years?
Well, they attempted to cut the spending they didn't like.
And the long
apparently not enough of it.
The longest shutdown in U.S. history, government shutdown, was under Trump's first 2 years. Something like 35, 36 days.
And what came of it?
Nothing.
Nothing. But going back to Mike's point, Mike can afford to go without a paycheck for a few weeks. Most of us around the table can. There's a lot of people that cannot afford to go even 1 week without a paycheck coming in.
Mr. Ferretti, you were up. You've been quiet for too long.
Well, yeah, I think John's right. I mean, the larger question is this good on any level? And it's not. This is just a fight between that small faction that gave McCarthy a hard time on voting him in as Speaker. Now they want to vote him out. So this is a squabble that's going to bring the country down with this small band of right-wingers in Congress who want to get rid of McCarthy. That's what this is all about. McCarthy can cut a deal today, right now, with about 5 or 7 Democrat votes to pass a continuing resolution or a spending bill that gets us through another year. But he won't do that because that's political suicide. The Senate has sent over, with Mitch McConnell's signature of approval, a budget that McCarthy rejected because he's trying to hang on to his job, and there's others who are inclined to try to get rid of him. So that's what this is all about. And in the meantime, while, yeah, we're going to continue to pay air traffic controllers and border guards, there's a lot of federal contractors who aren't going to get paid. And let me tell you, this supply chain situation in this country is not yet fixed. There's a lot of those contractors, both in public and private, who continue to struggle with getting employees and retaining management. And an interruption in their business is going to mean layoffs and some of these businesses going under because they are operating on a shoestring right now. And so that the long-term impacts on this are going to be bad for the country, but we're going to sit back and watch this little fight take place.
Larry, comes back to you.
I'm not sure that it's automatic that the border patrol will be paid. In fact, there's a pending bill right now to include them among those who will continue to receive paychecks despite
They're not allowed to do their
the
jobs
laws.
anyway.
Right. So it's the kind of thing where if there's any weakness in the Border Patrol, the amount of fentanyl that Americans and their allies bring across the Mexican-U.S. border is going to shoot up, whether the number of immigrants does or not. And that's a crisis. You don't have to go to New York to find stories about people dying of fentanyl overdoses. That's everywhere in this country.
I was told Coast Guard was also on that list you mentioned there, Larry, too. All right, we move on to the next issue, and for that we go to the cleanup hitter, Michael Carr.
Well, I'll make it quick.
We have 16 minutes. Take your time.
Oh, okay. All right. The incredible, growth and rash of shoplifting, and street crime in America, and the question is part or most of the explanation based on where it's happening, because it's not happening here in Martinsburg. It's not happening much at all in Texas or Florida. And we know where it's happening, and does that explain why it's happening? That's a question for everybody.
So we know where the crime is happening, and does that explain why it's happening? Can you be more specific?
Well, it's happening. It's happening in California and New York and Democrat-controlled cities.
All right. Well, that's the point that I need you to bring up.
I didn't think I was being too subtle, but that clearly is the point.
All right, Bill?
Yeah, I knew exactly where you're coming from, Mike. There was no doubt at all.
I got 3 attorneys in the conversation. I can't have generalities. I got to have specifics.
No, I applaud you for pinning them down, but Mike kind of prefaced this statement from his numerous other statements in the past.
Are those blasted elected Dems, Bill, causing all this crime?
Yeah, we do have a crime, but the crime is more inner cities. Do we say that we have crimes in Baltimore that exceed what we have in Miami, or exceed what we have in in perhaps Dallas. I don't know. We get more press, more visibility when something happens in Baltimore, and also Seattle recently, and Portland. Admittedly, Mike, all of those are controlled by Democratic mayors at this time. However, I don't think it's much as a political issue as what it is the demographics of that particular city.
Mr. Schultz.
Yeah, it stands to reason that it's unlikely that Philadelphia is going to be represented by a Republican mayor anytime soon. It also stands to reason that even if it were, and a majority on the city council of Philadelphia, very few things would change in terms of the crime rate.
I don't know if I agree with that, Larry. When Republicans were running New York, it was a much safer city crime-wise.
There's no question if you put a fascist like Rudy Giuliani in charge, that he'll begin running over people. And, what we don't have track of, we know crime went down. What we don't have track of is the number of innocent people who are overrun by Rudy Giuliani's police force.
But we do have a track of how many innocent people being overrun by the crime in New York City right now.
Well, we certainly do. And we also have a track of just exactly what kind of person Rudy Giuliani was. I'm not sure that the people of New York would be willing to make that trade again. And so we'll see. But yeah, I'm not. We've seen now what everybody in the Southern District of New York ignored about both Mr. Giuliani and Mr. Trump for many years. We're beginning to see it. And of course, one of the things you trade when you make those kind of trades is sometimes you trade a lot of small violent crimes for huge monetary crimes. And that's not necessarily a trade that people of New York want either. In the end, they have the right to vote for the leadership that they want. And I'm not seeing a big Republican surge. That was back in the 90s and in the early 2000s. I'm not seeing that coming back to New York or Philly or Chicago, despite the clearly big problem of this urban crime.
I think this pendulum swings. Before I go to Joe Ferretti, I think if you have, and we saw this in the 60s, the 70s, if you have enough crime, people will elect people who are tough on crime. And then if you have enough abuse of that power, people will elect people who are more lenient on crime in exchange for greater personal freedom. That'll swing back and forth. So anyway, Joe Ferretti, go ahead.
Well, part of this equation, too, in addition to questions about appropriate law enforcement, which I know Mike is driving at, part of the problem, too, is being a soft target. I think it was in Atlantic Monthly magazine, there was an article about and this is in one of the boroughs in New York City. A Costco is located right next to Target. The Target store gets hit with shoplifting all the time, and they suffer what the company calls shrinkage. And it's nationwide. The Target is one of the, for lack of a better term, targets of these shoplifters. Costco, on the other hand, their company leaders are proud to say that they don't have that problem. And you have to look at the store itself, too. Costco requires a membership. Costco, if anything, is overstaffed with people, employees, and security people. Try to enter a Costco without a membership and see what happens to you. Whereas Target, you walk in, the items are out there on display. They're typically understaffed. They rely upon self-checkout machines, and people grab stuff and just walk out. So these companies also have to get real with being a soft target, because in a study of two stores next to each other in an urban setting, one has very little shoplifting and another one has rampant shoplifting. So I think the companies themselves have to do an internal analysis as to why that's the case.
John.
Somebody burgles my house or comes into my house at night because I left the door open accidentally. That's not my fault. It's the people who came in to damage my home or to hurt my family. It's their fault. I think and this is a political issue, not in the sense that Mayor Giuliani or Mayor, I can't remember his name now, the current mayor of New York. They set the policies. They're the ones who empower the police to do what the police are going to do or not. Illinois just passed a law it bans cash bail for anybody. So if I understand the ramifications to that, you get arrested for something, there is no bailment, so you go home and you do it again. I think that we have policies that are permissive. Not only is it permissive of lawbreakers, but we're punishing the people who are defending themselves. Now, the news media will always cherry pick the most egregious examples of this, but we all remember the bodega owner in New York that went and defended the guy. Bad guys came in and were beating up on him. The bodega owner killed the bad guy, and the bodega owner was arrested for homicide because he shouldn't have killed the guy that was trying to kill him in his own store. So I think what we're seeing is these flash mob incidents that have been happening in Atlanta and Philadelphia, I think, over the last few days. This is new. This isn't some guy coming in and slipping an iPhone under his jacket. These are search and destroy missions. They drive a car, for God's sake, in through the front window, and they come out and they steal everything. There is a permissiveness. There's an air of permissiveness about this kind of activity, and that's new. That is since. I guess it started with the George Floyd riots, and it just hasn't been fixed. We are trying to vilify police forces now. We're trying to, in many communities, they are shrinking their police forces. In Portland, you can burn a courthouse, and that's not a riot, with people in it, by the way. So I don't want to blame this on at the feet of Democrats in general, because I think rank and file Democrats are really good folks. But when you have the showboat Democrats in national politics and in the big cities, that they're just vying for all the wrong vote, I think, and they like to see their names in the paper, and they seem not to care. And that's what's most concerning.
John, you say you're not blaming on Democrats. You sure did a persuasive argument that you were.
Not Democrats, not rank and file Democrats, but Democrat leaders, yeah.
But rank and file Democrats elect the
well, that's true.
elected. So.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, of course, and this seems to be available at all times now, we have people in the Republican Party called for defunding the FBI. And so,
quite loudly.
Is that the same thing? Or is that a completely different thing that has to do with our constitutional rights as rich people or something?
Is that a real question?
Yeah.
It has everything to do with the weaponizing the FBI against American citizens.
There you go.
Well, that's the
same argument.
No, it's not.
Smash and grab people.
That has
No, it's
nothing
not.
to do with
Yes, it is.
It's entirely different.
It's
Well
the
done,
exact same thing.
Larry, how's it the same thing?
Okay. You're committing crimes. We don't need to go through the long list of crimes that have been talked about.
Are we talking about me specifically, by the way? What do you know about my background?
You meaning recent Republican leaders have committed tons of crimes that are being exposed every day through new indictments, through civil suits, and when the police, in the name of the FBI, show up, what do we hear from the criminals? Why, you're weaponizing the FBI. And then, no, you're not weaponizing the FBI. You're enforcing the daggone law. Donald Trump's lies about the values of his properties go back 40 years.
We're talking
Isn't
about
it
different
time?
things. We're talking about different things. You and I are talking about different things with regard to the FBI. The FBI is listening to us. There are algorithms that listen to our phone calls. There are, and if you you change certain words together, you are going to be looked into. That I don't know if it's illegal. It should be illegal. And the Fourth Amendment has become kind of squishy in the hands of the current FBI. And not the FBI writ large, again, it's the leadership, the political leadership of the FBI sees their agency differently than I think they should.
I think if that is true, and I put a big capital IF at the beginning of that, if that is true, then it is certainly time for congressional hearings, and not congressional hearings where you call witnesses who confirm the other side's case, but congressional like we had yesterday, but congressional hearings where you bring in the guy who's going to prove that they're listening and using algorithms on our phone calls to entrap or snare us. Just prove it. we hear these allegations now all the time from the political right.
John,
And then it goes to a hearing, and there's nothing.
Yeah, John, I agree with you about FBI using information, but we ask them to do that every time there's a mass shooting. We say, why did you not put all these fabrics together so that we could get an indication there's a mass shooter? So basically, they're doing what we ask them to do, but there's some folks that argue they're doing too much of it.